Hi everyone, my name is Charlie and today I have my January wrap-up. January is a month in which I seemed to secret myself away in books a lot. Indeed, I have read more books than I usually do in January. However, they were all incredibly short books for the most part, and that was because there was part of me this month that felt like reading fiction that could be kind of over and done with rather quickly. I think it came with editing the final Doris book as well, so trying to get that done, I didn't want to disappear for tons of amounts of time away from a book I'm reading and then lose that sense of enjoyment. So I ended up navigating towards the smaller books. This also came from that part of me that likes thinking about the numbers, and I thought, if I can have quite an upsurge in the amount of books I read this month, I can dedicate some more time to the bigger books in subsequent months. That's what we should say. It's all about the numbers, really. Who's really reading on BookTube for the fiction and the actual literary quality? Anyway, the first book that I read and won't be talking about is 84 Charing Cross Road by Helen Hanff. Sarah of Hardcover Hearts hosted this read-along again on New Year's Day to read 84 Charing Cross Road. I did this last year. This year I read it and I forgot how short it was, so I reread The Duchess of Bloomsbury Street that I only read last month. And so you can go and see my thoughts on that in a rather recent wrap-up for December. But it's just, this is a book lover's book, and it really helps us to discover a time that is no longer here, a time of letters and politeness, and I quite liked it. It also explores a different love of literature, a different type of book enjoyment. Then I read Miss Marple's Final Cases by Agatha Christie, and I discussed this in a vlog that I have online where I read 4 Agatha Christie books. Miss Marple's Final Cases is a short story collection, and I wasn't the fondest of 2 of the stories that make up the end of this book, and because they had nothing to do with crime or Miss Marple. They just felt like they've been shoehorned in here, and having got another short story collection of Miss Marple stories, I don't understand why stories that were in there that hadn't been included in either the 13 Problems or this hadn't been used instead. But sometimes I thought that the stories were good, sometimes they were misses. It's just the way I feel about Agatha Christie short stories. I feel like, despite being an author I quite admire, Agatha Christie is also very much a hit and miss author for me. I'll continue to read her works regardless of that, but there are a lot of misses for me in the later end of her career. Latter half of her career? The end? I don't know. Either way, towards the end of her career, I tend to feel as though the prose petered out a bit. And some of the stories in here definitely emphasise that for me. Next we had The Panda, the Cat and the Dreadful Teddy by Paul Marrs. And this is a parody of that big bestseller that came out a few years ago, whose title I don't know. I got this because I follow Paul Marrs on Instagram. He is a writer that I formerly knew, having written Doctor Who books when I was younger and creating the Iris Wildtime series. And the only fiction I've read of his are the Brenda and Effie books, where it's the Bride of Frankenstein has set up a B&B in Whitby, and I've only read the first 2, and yesterday discovered there's actually a lot more in the series. I didn't know there were more, so that was something to look forward to. I just wanted to see whether it doesn't tell us anymore. But basically, this is a parody, and I'd say this appealed to the cynic within me. This appealed to that part of me who has previously looked at self-help books that are all about making you more mindful, but it does it with that very cynical slant that I might have lent towards as well in the past. So I very much enjoyed that. It felt like it was poking fun at the other book without being downright denigrating about its existence. And it was one of those that I was reading and I was thinking that if you're ever having a bit of a glum down day, then this could be one of those that you pick up just to read. But that's because I tend to get a lot of enjoyment out of being sarcastic and cynical. And I imagine if your sensibilities lean towards being kind all the time, then you might feel differently. Then I read My Name is Lucy Barton by Elisabeth Strout. I want to tell the origin story of me and Elisabeth Strout. 2 years ago, I think it was, Olive Again came up for the BookTube prize, and I thought, well, I'm going to have to read Olive Kitteridge before Olive Again. It says you don't have to, but I did. And I ended up liking Elisabeth Strout's prose. It's somewhat simple, but there is always a lot going underneath the surface, which is something I like. I don't mind something going on underneath the surface as long as the writer isn't trying to be all pretentious hoity-toity about it and act as though they're doing something funny. Don't care for pretentious. Anyway, me and my friend Joy were having a conversation before Christmas about Elisabeth Strout because she is also a fan. And I had got the O. William NetGalley proof. Then I saw that O. William came up in the Waterstone sale and bought it. I had Anything Is Possible, so I thought, well, I need to read My Name is Lucy Barton now. And I read it in one sitting. It's relatively short, large margins, but basically, margins is relatively short with large margins. Lucy Barton is in a hospital bed and her mother comes to visit her. They have a strained relationship, and this book is reminiscing over her youth, but also, whilst it's reminiscing, Lucy is beginning to recognise some of the... but she recognises the effects that her childhood have had on her as a person and how this has affected not just her in subsequent years, but her family as well. Like I say, an incredibly simple story that just reading what's going on will make you think, well, what are we doing here, really? A mother's gone to visit a daughter in hospital. Can we really go that much into it? But there is a lot to examine here. So I think there's a sort of sympathy and empathy there because Lucy Barton is born into somewhat impoverished circumstances, but she is someone who sought better for herself. But then you've got the sense of guilt that comes from bettering yourself and having to leave your family behind and the repercussions of that. But it's just such easy prose to get through, such an easy narrative. It's like gliding through butter. It was fantastic. I really like Elisabeth Strout's prose, which is why I read Anything Is Possible immediately afterwards. Now, this is a short story collection, really, that goes back to Amgash, which is where Lucy Barton was born. And whilst it mentions the Barton characters a lot, or what people's ideas of Lucy Barton might have been, this is more about learning what Lucy Barton's world was like when she was a child and exploring the lives of characters we may have heard about in that first book, or indeed mentioning the lives of characters that we may hear about in the very same book that we are reading and going and exploring the truth behind that narrative. We do get to see Lucy Barton again, and we do get to see what her relationship is like after the supposed release of her biography, where people are getting an idea of who Lucy Barton is and who her family might have been and what her family's opinions are of that, who her family are, how they could be the people that they are. And again, delightfully deceptive prose in that there is so much going on here. They're such slim volumes, and I got this with Olive Again and Olive Kitteridge. There is something about the atmosphere, the tone, the way in which it's written, the attitudes of people. You get to learn that, just in terms of writing here for a second, to look at it from the writerly perspective, Elisabeth Strout here is doing something that I haven't even considered in my own writing, is that a character is not just made up of what the author perceives this character to be, or how the author has decided to write the character. Indeed, it's looking at it from a level of humanity, really, and saying a character is also made up of what people think of that character in the world in which they're living. And you could be writing who you think is a brilliant protagonist who's never done something wrong in their life, but there is always going to be one person within the town in which they live that is going to have a reason to dislike them. It could just be that they served them once at a shop and they felt like they weren't being treated as a customer in the nicest possible manner. And that is going to cause some sort of disdain. Here, we're getting to see what Amgash thinks about the entire situation, but it also felt a bit like an American version of Cranford in that we're getting this idea of all of these people's different opinions of what went on in Lucy Barton and the other residents of the town in which they live. And I just think, I thought it was superb. I really, really did. And that's all you're going to hear when I talk about Elisabeth Strout going forward, I think. Okay, we've talked about things going on underneath the surface. Well, let's talk about A Tidy Ending by Joanna Cannon. Very kindly got sent the proof of this book. And I did consider reviewing this properly until the book comes out in April. Indeed, I considered waiting and reading it, but I can't do that. I just can't do it. When it's Joanna Cannon, who is a favourite writer of mine, I could not wait to read this one. Here we have the character of Linda. Now, you get the sense that Linda might not really understand the way that society works. It was a bit like going back to Eleanor Oliphant is completely fine in the style of the character here. One of those people who's on the periphery, doesn't really know what's going on. You get the sense that there's been a tragedy in her life. I'll read you the blurb. I don't do it ordinarily. Linda has lived around here ever since she fled the dark events of her childhood in Wales. Now she sits in her kitchen wondering if this is all there is. Pushing the hoove around and cooking fish fingers for tea is a far cry from the glamorous lifestyle she sees in the glossy catalogues coming through the door for the house's previous occupant. Terry isn't perfect. He picks his teeth, tracks dirt through the house and spends most of his time in front of the TV. But that seems fairly standard until he starts keeping odd hours at work at around the same time young women start to go missing in the neighbourhood. If Linda could just track down Rebecca, who lived in the house before them, maybe some of that perfection would rub off on her. But the grass isn't always greener. You can't change who you really are, and there's something nasty lurking behind the net curtains on Cavendish Avenue. Similar to The Trouble with Goats and Sheep and Three Things About Elsie, we have very normal working class people, and I love to see that explored in fiction. What I also loved about this book is that Linda works in the charity shop a few days a week, and I thought, well, here we go, flaming soul sister right here. We get on. I got on with Linda. What actually happened with Linda was that Linda ended up reminding me of a volunteer that I used to have, who famously things ended very badly with when I thought I was being made redundant and this person asked whether she could have my job now. I can't say Charlie was particularly nice that day, having just been told he no longer had a job, and then this person, unknowing, looking back, if an older, more mature Charlie, who wasn't 23 at the time and what have you, might have handled things differently. But Linda also reminded me of this person very much also in the way that the first time I met this same volunteer, she said she hadn't had a holiday in 5 years, so would I take her on holiday? And I'd never met her before in my life. And I thought, oh well, my exact words then were, I'm 21, I've never had an holiday in my life. You should be taking me on holiday. Make it a joke, that sort of thing. But that's what I got reminded of. And I felt like Joanna Cannon captured this sort of person so incredibly well. You also know that Linda is striving for this glamorous life she sees in the magazines, and she doesn't know how to achieve it. She's striving to make friends with people and not knowing how to make friends with them. She just doesn't have those social cues. And then you've got added murder into the mix, and you know that there is something bad that happened in Linda's past that meant that she had to move away from Wales, and that's how she ended up in the situation that she's in. And then, in the end, the book ended in a fashion that I completely didn't see coming, and I loved it, and I was supportive of it. And the reason I was supportive of it was because I'd kind of got behind Linda now, and I was thinking, I want you to have success, whatever that means. And I really, really enjoyed this. I enjoyed how dark it was. I enjoyed the fact that once again Joanna Cannon is employing this style that is reminiscent of Alan Bennett, in that she's able to capture voices and characters so incredibly well. Maybe this just is who Joanna Cannon is. Maybe likening it to Alan Bennett is the wrong thing to do. Maybe I should just say that if you have read Joanna Cannon and you know how she so closely examines who people are and what makes them who they are, and the people that she wishes to represent in her fiction, then you can understand the reason that this book exists. I've recently been watching One Foot in the Grave, and I'd say that this kind of fits that mould a bit well as well, in that it's comedic and light-hearted at parts, but the author doesn't stray away from having these darker tones in here and these darker events happening. Yet it still remains something of a light-hearted read, but is also something that does beg to be reread, to look back at signs and ideas over what we might have missed the first time around. I thought it was great. I really did. If there is a genre called like a domestic thriller, then here we go, but maybe that's a bit darker. A cozy thriller? I don't know. I don't know how to categorise this book other than Joanna Cannon's done it again. We're 3 for 3 in terms of the novels, and let's not forget Breaking and Mending. And I hope that when we do get to April, you'll go out and purchase this, because once more, just everything is captured so brilliantly. I think if you're a fan of Rachel Joyce or Sarah Winman, then you will really like A Tidy Ending. Next, we have The Death of Francis Bacon by Max Porter, which is... I don't know how to explain it. I don't know whether this was ekphrastic. I actually tried with this one. As I say, Francis Bacon is on his deathbed. And these are... I don't know what. I don't know. I have absolutely no idea what was going on in this book at all. For me, it's a complete miss. Maybe if you know the life of Francis Bacon, then you will really get something out of this book, or the death of Francis Bacon, maybe you will get something out of this book. But having read Grief is the Thing with Feathers and Lanny, and rather appreciating and enjoying these books, I just had absolutely no idea what the author slash poet slash creator was thinking with this book, which is unfortunate. Indeed, I did turn to everyone and say I was glad that I got it in a sale, and I ended up not caring that it had a tear in the top, because I only kept this book to do this video and see whether my opinion changed over the 25 days since I read it, and it hasn't. I have absolutely no idea what the creator was trying to do or say. I don't know what it was meant to be. I don't know what sort of form it was meant to take. It felt like a waste of my time, and I'm sad about that. It's now 2 hours later. The hair is changed. There's now mud on my collar from my brother's dog jumped up at me. You've moved slightly, because what had happened was nobody bothered to tell me that we had somebody come in to check the insulation in the house. So I'll get into that story later in another video. But he walked across my room. He's accidentally moved, I'm assuming it's an accident, the bookcase I sit you on. And if you hear any noises in the background, it's either the dog, my mother cooking, or my father. There's the dog, because I couldn't be bothered waiting any longer. The next book I read is Oh William by Elisabeth Strout. William is the husband that Lucy Barton talks about divorcing in the first book. And here we have her examining their relationship after they have got divorced, because they still have a nice relationship with each other. There is still some love there. Obviously, they have children together, they have that connection. And William's latest wife is divorcing him. And so now it's delving into William's abandonment issues and where he came from, examining his life, what brought him into Lucy's life, and how they might have separated once they realised that they had changed as people and they could no Not that they couldn't rely on each other anymore, but that they were different people than when they first met. It is more of a depiction of what comes after divorce. Divorce is not just a separation. It's not so clean cut sometimes. There are these connections that still linger, these roots that can't be broken, that sort of thing. And it does it all very deftly and very beautifully, I might add. I mean, I've enjoyed Elisabeth Strout's prose. We've talked about that. And I just enjoy the way that Strout crafts a tale. This entire book felt like a conversation, not just with Lucy and herself, but Lucy's having this almost silent conversation with her husband. There is this sense of will they, won't they, about the whole thing, which I suppose has come from media always thinking that the best resolution to a story and a love story is for that couple to get together. But sometimes you need a narrative that's about, well, what comes afterwards? What comes after the love and the recognition that people do change? Insightful into life and into people's behaviours. I am rather grateful it exists, as I am with all of the Elisabeth Strout books that I've read. Next, I read Square Haunting by Francesca Wade, which, as it says, is 5 women, freedom and London between the wars. These are women, I have to check, because I originally said that they all lived at the same address, but I think they just lived on the same street. So you had HD, the modernist poet, who I didn't know about, Dorothy L. Sayers, who I did know about but haven't yet read. I have seen the Lord Peter Wimsey TV show. I used to watch that with my grandmother. Jane Allen Harrison, who I didn't previously know about but really wish to know more about now because she sounds like a fantastic historical figure. Eileen Power, once again somebody that I was ashamed not to know about, and Virginia Woolf, who after reading this I really wanted to go and actually read some more of Virginia Woolf. I really enjoyed watching Sarah of Hardcover Hearts, and she has been buddy reading the Virginia Woolf novels over the last year with, I apologise for forgetting the other person, but I will find out and leave a mention in the description. Is it Elisabeth of Bookish North? I don't know. I will check. Anyway, there's a bit in here where it's discussing how there was a historian, and I believe it was Jane Harrison, who wanted to look at the ordinary lives of people. And I liked that Francesca Wade seemed to do that herself. Whilst she's looking at the interwar period, what we're getting is more of an idea of not just the struggles that women face, but the way that these women help to pave the way for other women to be more successful in their lives. But she also is taking a look at the ordinary lives, not the people in power and what they did between the wars or how that came to be, but the actual feeling of people on the streets and what they were fighting against, the emotions that they might have been feeling. I liked the back and forth that this book did. So it does seem to have this linear storyline, really. Each chapter is focused on a different historical figure who lived on this street in Bloomsbury, and how they came to sometimes have connections to one another that they might not have known about. And it just follows each one of them. But then there are times when their stories interweave with each other, intertwine. And I like that the author got that in there. I like the idea that these historical figures lived at the same street, and the significance that this might have had. I liked learning more about these people that I didn't previously know about. And I thought that it was a really brilliantly told piece of non-fiction that continued to engage the reader. I'll admit that the story of Dorothy L. Sayers and learning more about her life, I was just astounded. I didn't know any of this about her, and it really made me want to go and read her books. I wanted to read them in the past, but I've just not got there yet. This is one of those that could be a starter text in going and discovering more about these women and their works and how influential they were. I think that it paints a good portrait of what life was like for these women of that time, and it also does discuss their privilege, how they wouldn't have been able to have the lives that they do have if they didn't come from backgrounds of privilege. And it does give that uneasy question, really, of had these been ordinary working class women, would they have been able to achieve as much as they did? But on the other hand, did their striving for greatness and their not bowing down to the adversity they faced, did that in turn help the working class woman, indeed working class people. There's a lot of discussions to be had about this book, and I very much appreciated that. Sorry, I had to stop to sneeze there, and it's completely ruined everything. It's nothing catching, I've just got a spot of hay fever, which, well, I've just got a few allergies. I'm allergic to everything. I have to be honest and admit that I have forgotten the name of the author of the next thing that I read, which is a poetry collection called The Mask, and I was sent an electronic file of this book to read, and it's a poetry collection celebrating Frida Kahlo with ekphrastic poems that are all related to a piece of work that Frida Kahlo created. Being a fan of the artist, when I was asked whether I would like a review copy, I jumped at the chance, but unfortunately I did not care for the poems. When it comes to this style of poetry, what you really want the poems to do is enhance the experience of viewing the art piece, and this didn't do that. Indeed, the poems here, for me, lacked structure, and the substance of them felt as though there was too much unsaid, but there was nothing to read between the lines and figure out what the poet wanted to actually get at. There were images within certain poems that I did not care for, and I did not understand their inclusion. They did nothing to serve the art at all, and it felt very much like I could tell the poet was a fan of the artist, but that doesn't necessarily translate to good poetry, which was unfortunate. But I think a lot more work needed to be done on these poems. They felt unfinished. They felt like emotion had got in the way. Whilst we can go and we can research and look at the images that the poet is referencing, when you look at these images and then you look at the poem, you think, well, how did you get that? There's just no cohesion between the two. A knowledge of an artist's life and an appreciation of an artist doesn't necessarily lend itself to good poetry, and that's the issue I had here, which is a shame. Next, I read The Shape of Water by Andrea Camilleri, and this book was translated by Stephen Sartarelli. This is the first book in the Inspector Montalbano series. A body is found in a car of an engineer, and despite the fact that it is seen as death by natural causes, Inspector Montalbano thinks that there might be more than meets the eye, because it does seem a bit suspicious. And in this book, we're not necessarily looking at a murder mystery or the standard sort of crime. This is a novel that is going to look at corruption within politics, and also discusses a few things going on in Italy politically in 1993 when this book was originally released. Luckily for any English or English-speaking readers, the translator has included a few historical notes in the back of this book to help us understand what's going on. I have wanted to read Inspector Montalbano for years, since first viewing the television show, and I think now, after reading this first book, they've managed to capture the book very well on screen, because this book very much feels like a satire of the crime genre. It's very quick, fast-paced. You can read this one in about an hour, hour and a half, and I'm looking forward to continuing the series. I have to say there were a few things I had issues with in terms of language used and the way certain people were viewed in the book, but I also liked that this book gives us a beginning of understanding Montalbano's standing as a policeman, but also that the sense of corruption that's going to run throughout the subsequent books. Is it corruption if it's... well, there's still some corruption there, but if it's done for the good of a person, is it okay? I don't know. I thoroughly enjoyed this one and think that it's a great start to a crime series, and I look forward to continuing it, which is good because I bought 10 of these books from the charity shop. Next, I read The Marlow Murder Club by Robert Thorogood, and this book sees 77-year-old Judith, who enjoys swimming naked through the Thames, solving a crime, solving a murder, because she's swimming in the Thames one night when she hears a gunshot come from a neighbour's house, goes home, rings the police, and they say there's nothing to worry about. So she ends up going across to this neighbour's house, and what do you know, the next day she finds his dead body. And then when she begins to investigate herself, she discovers that he might not have been the nicest person. She ends up teaming up with Susie, a local dog walker, and Bex, the vicar's wife. And it says they form the Marlow Murder Club, but really, they're just... That title, I don't think, actually gets used officially in the book. They end up investigating, and this is, as I said when I've talked about this book before, this was more of a how done it, because everybody can see who this killer is going to be. But how can it be? Because they have an alibi, a very watertight alibi, like cameras on them and everything. But Judith knows there's something awry there. Also, Judith has a history herself, a bit of tragedy in her background that her friends have decided to investigate. And I just thought that this was another brilliant start to a series. Very fast-paced, cosy almost, rather reminiscent of the tone of the Thursday Murder Club by Richard Osman. Indeed, they did come out at similar times, and I think this one ended up being overshadowed by that release. But I loved the characterisation, and I just felt like this had the great beginnings of a series, introducing the characters, showing how they work together, and the scrapes that they find themselves in. And it's almost a tale of forgotten women. These are the people that society has kind of thought, do you know what? You're past it now. And these women are striving to say, actually, we're still here, we're still important, and you're going to pay attention to us. And I very much enjoyed that. I also saw a few things that reminded me of my own book, which was nice. Because we know I was just writing standard cosy crime, so if other people are doing it, I must have been doing something okay. But yeah, Marlow Murder Club, if you're looking for a very fantastic, strong first book in a crime series, then you wouldn't go wrong then to read this one. Then we have The Cat Who Saved Books by Sosuke Natsukawa, and this one was translated by Louise Kawai. So, here we have Rintaro. His grandfather's just died, and rather than go to school, Rintaro is staying at the bookshop and just reading books all day. He believes that nobody really cares about him. People bring him work, but he's really steering clear of society until this cat comes along and says, I need your help. We're going to have to travel to these almost parallel worlds and discuss the importance of books. To me, it felt a bit like a Christmas Carol in terms of the storytelling. Rintaro and this cat travel to different places. Each time Rintaro has to describe the importance of books and literature and how they improve our lives. And each time he gains more, he begins to accept his grief and move on from the death of his grandfather, even though this is taking place very close to his grandfather's death. There was a term here, hikikomori, which is literally, this is the translator's note, it literally means to pull inwards and confine. It refers to people, often young men, who have consciously decided to shut themselves away from society, rarely venturing outside to school or work. And that just sounded like me, and I was feeling a lot of sympathy and empathy for Rintaro in those moments. I could understand his grief and why that had made him disappear into himself. It seemed very reminiscent of stuff I'd gone through myself as a young person. And I just thought that, as well as a celebration of books, it was also a great portrayal of grief and how we get through that. And I enjoyed this idea that this character was recognising that whilst he thinks the world has shut him out, so he's going to accept that maybe he begins to accept actually there are people there within his life who would appreciate him to come out of his shell a bit more and not get over his grief incredibly quickly, but recognise that it's a process and you still have to move through the world. And I just thought that it was very emotive, and that for such a short book it managed to pack a lot in. I also enjoyed the fantastical surreal elements that were in here of going into these parallel worlds and having to explain away why fiction, especially long classic fiction, is still important to the modern world and the way we think and behave. So yeah, brilliant. Brilliant little book. Next we have At Mrs. Lippincote's by Elisabeth Taylor. This was the first Elisabeth Taylor ever to be released and is set during the war. Julia's husband Roddy is part of the RAF, and because of that they've been sent to live on this base at Mrs. Lippincote's house. Julia is struggling to acclimatise. She is somebody who wants to feel emotion, and she very much dotes on her son. She allows him to be a bit insolent towards her and linger in bed all day reading rather than send him off to school. She's very protective of him, and throughout the novel you get the idea as to why. Her husband Roddy and his sister, who also lives with them, are very stiff, upper-lipped type people who just believe that women should do what they're supposed to do, cook in the kitchen, keep the house tidy, and not feel anything, and just follow the demands of their husbands, really. And oh, it's not his sister, it's his cousin who wishes she was married to him. I've just remembered that, yeah. So anyway, we don't like her. I'll say for a first novel, you can tell it's a first novel because Elisabeth Taylor does pack a lot in here, which I believe she actually takes the time to explore in her later novels. Indeed, the climax to this did remind me very much of the climax to In a Summer Season, but it's Elisabeth Taylor, and she writes beautifully, and she captures character really well, and I thought that for a first book, and for a book that is actually discussing the war whilst the war is going on. So it's first published in 1945, so the war had only been finished a year. It does discuss a lot of the fears that a person might have had, and the fact that Julia isn't even allowed, really, to think about the fact that one of her children has died, or she's not allowed to feel anything. She's not allowed to go out and enjoy herself because she's supposed to give off this idea of being this very refined woman who doesn't really leave the house, and she thinks about all the social niceties and the way it can be perceived if someone comes to the back door and gives her a hat pin, how that could be perceived by the other people, because she might be seen, her husband might be seen as not caring for her enough to even go out and get her hat pins. She's seen as not really being a proper woman or a proper housewife because she doesn't understand all these different things she's supposed to understand. She's not allowed to be young, she's not allowed to feel anything, and yet her husband is still seen as this great person, even though he's going off and he's shagging about, really. Whilst there is a lot going on in this book, and I can see where Elisabeth Taylor was going because she included these themes in other books of hers that I have read, I was also glad to see where the tale started, and it's also, there's humour here, and there's also more freedom in the prose because she's just allowing herself to get all of her thoughts out on the page. Next, I read On Mutability by Jo Shapcott, which is a poetry collection I've been meaning to read for a while, and when I saw that it was available on BorrowBox, I instantly downloaded it and read it. Thought it was amazing, thought it was brilliant. It does everything that I really like in poetry, which is consider sound and the way the poems are going to sound, the way that it has half rhyme and assonance, which are some of my favourite things. For me, as I say, poetry, my favourite kind of poetry plays with sound, and that's what this collection did. In order to enhance the experience for the reader, I thought there was some very emotive poems in here. Unfortunately, I had to return it, but there was one poem in particular where the poet says to the reader that you are an owl, and it discusses you being an owl and the bones and everything in such a way that for me it was an incredibly visceral experience reading that one. It creeped me out a bit to have this idea of like bones crunching to fit into the small confines of an owl's body, but then at the same time, as you moved on throughout the poem, there was this also this sense of freedom, because now you're like soaring across fields and things, and it was just an experience I haven't really had when it comes to reading poetry, and I liked that. Then we had a bit of a failure with a poetry collection, and I felt bad about it because it was Mary Oliver and this was dream work. I just didn't get on with it. It's not the kind of poetry that I enjoy. I don't necessarily go into poetry looking for philosophical lines or these ideas about life, the universe and everything. I'm very much focused on rhythm, and that's what I'm trying to envisage how these poems would sound. Dream work failed for me because I felt like the poet was in the poems too much. I felt like we were very much getting her thoughts and her feelings, but there wasn't really any strong image there. It was just, I believe this, I feel this. And whilst it might have been formatted like poetry, for me it was too much like just thoughts on a page. I needed some more imagery in there. And admittedly, it was there in a few poems, and for about 3 poems I was thrilled, but the rest of the collection kind of fell flat for me, and I was like, well, what am I reading here? What am I supposed to garner from these poems? It felt like a disappointment because everyone's been recommending Mary Oliver for years and really citing her poetry as some of the best, and it left me cold. I didn't feel anything for the poems here. Next, I read Things We Do Not Tell the People We Love by Huma Qureshi, and this is a short story collection that does what it says on the tin. This is perhaps the saddest short story collection I have ever read, and it begins with a very sad short story indeed that at first it seems so inconsequential. It seems like the tale of first love, and I thought, where's this going really? I couldn't understand. You know, this woman is walking into a house party, and when she walks in, she sees somebody across the room, and it's told from the you voice. So immediately you have this sense of shared experience with the narrator. And you're like, well, who am I? Who is this you that the narrator is speaking to? Which gets you as the reader to question what your role in this narrative is. And it begins, and the narrator is really singing the you character's praises. And well, if you've ever read a short story, or a poem even, you know that there's always a turn in the tale, and this one was particularly dark, which really, as a reader, I ought to have guessed, because when we consider the culture that the author is describing in her short stories, then it makes sense to have this dramatic turn in the tale that is full of pathos, really. You get to see how what we would deem as normal teenage experiences in certain cultures can be seen as immoralities, and how they can affect a person's life detrimentally, and how one teenage boy's lies can really harm the opinion that people have of a teenage girl. And unfortunately, this narrator has no way of fighting back and saying anything because of the way that she is viewed by the people in her culture. And then this continues throughout. The next story is one fueled by anger, and you get that. And what I just want to say about all of the poems in this collection, really, apart from, okay, so the last story in this collection is more hopeful than the rest of the stories within the collection, but that is because it's mostly sad throughout the final story in this collection, and it's just filled with hope, and you just end up hoping for a nice resolution to that story, because if you're stuck with all the stories in this collection throughout, they are sad, emotive, brilliantly told. There was one story in here I particularly liked called The Jam Maker, that captured a sense of what it means to be a child, and how we view our parents as children to how we view them when we get older. There is a lot in here that's more about the relationships between parents and their children. Too much was a surprisingly sad tale. They'd all been sad, really, but it was more that the reader there's this dramatic irony in Too Much, in that the reader is able to see what the narrator can't. Don't know where that one's going to go, as you don't really know where most of these stories are going to go. And I think that that's a great skill as a writer. I think that Huma Qureshi has written a superb, fantastic, brilliant, all my adjectives are superfluous at this point, but I did think that this collection was particularly brilliant, and it did what I like short stories to do, which is to take us on a journey. It was almost like poetry, and it was just a brilliant use of writerly craft. Next, I want to talk about 3 books together, and they constitute Deborah Levy's living memoir. They are Things I Don't Want to Know, The Cost of Living, and Real Estate. A few years ago, I read The Man Who Saw Everything, also by Levy, and a few weeks back, a person got in touch with me and said that because I had given that book such a good review on NetGalley, they were sending me the link to download the living memoir. So I did that. And then I read it in a week. And I was particularly thrilled. So thrilled that I sent the person who'd given me the downloads a message thanking her. And as thanks for the message I sent, they were kind enough to send me the physical copies because I said I really wanted them for my own library. Because I did. Because these are books that I want to reread. These are books that are discussing not just Deborah Levy's life, but her philosophy behind writing. I was reminded of Rachel Cusk's Outline trilogy when I read this. The prose and the way it was written. So this does what I like memoir to do. Memoir, good memoir, as I always say, should read like good fiction. When it comes to biography, I have a problem. Memoir is just one of these where people in the know will use literary techniques in order to tell their tale. So what Deborah Levy is doing here is she's going all Dickensian here. She is living in the past, the present, and the future in order to tell her narrative, to talk about the person that she has become today and how her life has ended up giving her the philosophy that she has. Things I Don't Want to Go is a very slim but important volume in the life of Deborah Levy, and it did what it was supposed to do, really, because it made me interested in her as not just a person but as a creator. You're not just getting her writing philosophy, you're getting to know about her relationships, where she's been in her life. In 163 pages we get to hear about the start of her life, the start of her writing career, and her philosophy on writing. The reason I want to discuss them all in one go is because I read them all in one go. And as I say, I believe that they are perfect memoirs. I think that the casual reader is going to be wondering what the devil she was getting at when she talks about how she wants to write in the style where time isn't linear and the past is as important as the present, and it kind of merges. And there's a particular scene that keeps going through my head where she's just in a kitchen, and while she's in that kitchen it flashes back to South Africa when she was returning to South Africa with her daughters, having not been there for years, and she's putting out all these places to her daughters, and then it goes back to the kitchen and it's just seamless. And in that moment, I understood exactly what Levy was doing, not just with her writing, but what she wanted to achieve. And I think that she achieved it incredibly well. I am thrilled that I had the opportunity to read these books. I think that they're fantastic. And if you're looking for any sort of good memoir, then it's here. Then I read Time is a Mother by Ocean Vuong. Another NetGalley proof, because I was also trying to get through all of them this month. Fantastic poetry collection again. I don't know how else to say it, really. Ocean Vuong has written poems that I would love to see performed. The poet does not steer away from darker images or things that might cause the reader to think. It is dark, propulsive poetry, and the images and the life captured and the life experiences captured within these poems surprised me, challenged me even, and I thought that was particularly grand indeed. I don't know that there's more that I could say other than I look forward to owning again a physical copy of this book and going through and reading it and seeing how it was formatted on the page, because I couldn't really read it on my Kindle properly. But I just look forward to the experience of going back and rereading this, not just because of thinking that it's going to be a fantastic experience again, but because I just want to re-examine everything. I think it's another collection where the more you read, the more you're going to get out of the poems, the more you look at it and think about the way things have been made to sound and how they've been structured, it's only going to enhance the experience, and I think that's always a good thing. Next we have Queer by William S. Burroughs, which was apparently a sequel to his book that I can't even remember the title of right now, but it came out 25 years after the first book and is a continuation of that first book, but this is a edited edition where the editor has taken some pieces from that first book, has taken stuff that was originally cut out when this book was released to make a more clear narrative. It follows a character who is basically, he fancies a straight man. They end up going somewhere together, and I don't know. This was a book where I didn't get what was going on with it, but I read it, and then I went back and I read the introduction, and when I read the introduction, I understood what the author was trying to do in the actual tale, but I also wasn't sure about the necessity of the tale, because I thought if the author steered clear of releasing this for so long, it's maybe something that I hadn't read this author before, but I think that if I'd read other books by this author and I'd enjoyed them, I would have gone back to this just to be a completionist. I don't think it was a good place to start reading this writer. I thought that it was interesting enough. It reminded me of the decade in which this tale was written, with it having such an abrupt ending and no real development of story. I'm not really sure about the necessity of it all. Next, I read The Gold-Rimmed Spectacles by an author whose name I've forgotten and a translator I've forgotten, but I will leave a link in the description. This is set in Italy and discusses fascism, but does it by also looking at the life of this doctor who happens to be gay, but nobody says anything about it until someone deliberately chooses to discuss who he is in a public arena so that it becomes knowledge to everybody and they begin to question how they interact with him. And apparently this is set before World War II and is discussing the rise of that and how people are trying to protect themselves in Europe because they can see that it's happening. Also discussing fascism in Italy at the time. I was glad to have read more Italian fiction and more historical Italian fiction, but I did find this book rather dry. I thought that it was sometimes very deftly written, very subtle. I thought that in certain scenes the writer was describing this character very well and we were getting a good impression of who this character was and what he meant to other people. You don't really find out who the narrator is until quite far into the book, and the narrator's story is a good parallel in that he comes from a Jewish family as the war is about to kick off again, and you get to see how they're both outcast by the world, but one of them is more accepted than the other. I think that when you look at it from a social context and a historical context, it's a good book to read, but I do think I'd have to read more by this author to get a proper understanding of what's going on, because apparently there are other books set in a similar location about similar themes and they all make up almost a quartet of fiction, but this was the only one available on Borrow Box at the time. Next you have The Seven Kinds of People You Find in Bookshops by Sean Bithell, who also wrote The Diary of a Bookseller and Confessions of a Bookseller. Very quick book to read. Wasn't really a fan, but also at the same time it did inspire me to maybe examine the kinds of people we get who come into the charity shop. From a retail perspective, I felt sympathy with the author and was laughing at moments because they felt like all the kinds of people that we get in retail. There were a few humorous anecdotes in here, but it didn't grab me the way that Diary of a Bookseller and Confessions of a Bookseller have. And I don't really have much more to say about it than that. I read it in an hour one morning and I'm glad I got it off Borrow Box because it's not necessarily something that I would ever go back and reread, unlike The Diary of a Bookseller and Confessions of a Bookseller. And maybe it's unfortunate for me to compare this book to the author's previous works, but that's what happened. And
I understood what the author was getting at, and I think that as a piece of non-fiction, it's very easy, mindless non-fiction to sink your teeth into, and if you've ever worked in retail, you're going to enjoy the experience of reading this, but I do think it's a one-and-done type book. I don't think there's anything to really go back and indulge in again. I got Swallowing Geography by Deborah Levy because it was the first different piece of fiction that my library has had in by Deborah Levy in years. This was the first piece of fiction that I believe Levy released back in the 1990s. It reminded me of the works of the 1990s that I have read in a similar vein. And like those books, I had absolutely no idea what was going on, but I was here for it. It goes back and forth in time and character, no real sense of who anybody is, but also a bit involved and surreal and begs rereading and trying to piece these fractious vignettes together to try and make some sense of everything. It was like a jigsaw puzzle where nothing really fits, but also there's a lot of experimentation going on with storytelling here, and I liked seeing the beginnings of an author's career, and having read the living memoir, I could understand where the author was coming from with this book, even if I didn't particularly understand what was going on in the text. You get to see the beginnings of her writing style and the form that she's going for, even though it's not 100% there yet. And I'd say, again, as I said with Mrs. Lippincote's, I'd probably try and read Levy's later fiction and go back to this if you're a completionist. But I also really enjoyed how this was basically, to me, it felt like just a complete sodger to the literary world, and just I'm going to do my own thing over here, and you're just going to have to accept that. And I have to say, I do like that sort of thing in my fiction sometimes. Then I read Death in Her Hands by Ottessa Moshfegh. I can't say why I disliked this book without spoiling it, but I did wonder whether the author had ever owned a dog before in her life. Because that's what ruined the entire book for me. This book, I didn't mind, wasn't a straightforward crime thriller. This woman, Vesta, finds a note whilst walking a dog in the woods that says her name was Magda, they'll never find a body or something like that. And Vesta decides to create the life of this person for herself, the death as well. And she creates an entire portrait of who Magda was, who she might have been, and what happened to her. And she goes exploring the town that she lives in, but she doesn't really know anybody, and she's moved here after the death of her husband. It talks about a lone woman moving through the world with her dog. And then I was appreciative of that. I liked this quiet, contemplative style of story. It's not something I used to enjoy, but I've been enjoying it recently. And then, out of nowhere, you got that final climactic scene that just ruined the entire experience for me of reading the book. And that's all I can say about it, really. The climax in this novel, the final scene, felt like it had been shoehorned in there for nothing more than emotional impact. It felt very forced. It felt like, I want the reader to feel something, and this is the cheapest way I can do it. And it did. It felt cheap, it felt tacky, it felt unnecessary, it didn't feel lifelike, it came out of nowhere, and didn't fit with the overall tone of the narrative, and maybe that's what Moshfegh was going for, but it didn't work for me, and I don't think it was realistic at all. And because of that, I just felt like this was a damp squib of a book that was really nicely moving along and I could enjoy, and then out of nowhere it decided to do this very cheap tacky thing, and I was just like, well, you've lost me now, and that's never a good thing. So it was a disappointing end to the month is all I can say, but I am currently reading two other books that I unfortunately didn't finish before the end of January. A Single Man by Christopher Isherwood, which I've nearly finished, and The Last Firefox by Lee Newberry, both of which are fantastic books that I look forward to talking to you about in February's wrap-up. Now though, all I have left to say is, them's the books. If you have read any of these books and would like to discuss them, please feel free to do so in the comments. I hope that you have enjoyed this video, and until next time, that is all.